Greetings. I'm Daniel Jacobson, Director of the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. John Eastman. Professor Eastman is our visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy for the year. He is Henry Salvatori Professor of Law and Community Service and former Dean of the Law School at Chapman University. He has a distinguished career, which includes a PhD in government from the Claremont Graduate School and a JD from the University of Chicago Law School. He has 2 clerkships, including one with Clarence Thomas, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, and he's published numerous articles on more topics than I can relate. Today he's going to talk to us about the United States as independent community, a particular rooted in the universal. Professor Eastman.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thanks to all the Benson Center folks that have made this possible. I know it's not the most optimal of circumstances to do it via Zoom, but I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to my talk to you all and hopefully getting some good feedback. Our lecture series this year at the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization is Community and Disunity. I'm going to begin at the beginning of our American community when it became a separate community, and then turn to what I see as several disunity threats to that community, both historical and current. And then hopefully at the end offer some prospect for hope. So to begin at the beginning, July 4th, 1776, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. That's the opening statement of the Declaration of Independence. And I want to make 3 points about that opening statement that are relevant to my talk. First, the phrase one people. That phrase is in some sense generic, universal. It could apply to any people seeking to declare their independence from any other people. That idea, that language foreshadows the claims of universal truth that are going to follow in the Declaration of Independence. Second, in its particular application, and that is evidenced by the title of the document, the Unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America, the phrase one people indicates a particular people, a union of all 13 colonies as a single political community, not merely 13 separate communities acting in limited concert for a singular purpose. Although plural words are used several times later in the document, such as the need to alter their former systems of government, plural, at the end of paragraph 2, and the multiple reference in the final paragraph to states, they, and them, the broader point of the document is that of union, a point referenced by the double, reinforced by the double reference to united in the concluding paragraph. Subsumed within that union, of course, are the more local communities of the various states. But that structure, what we call our federalism, was made possible by the novel idea that the sovereign authority of the united national good people of these colonies could be subdivided between a united central government and the several component parts. The closing claim that as free and independent states, they have a full power to levy war, conclude peace, etc., must therefore be read in light of the union for which the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled had declared independence. That point of union was confirmed by the Articles of Confederation, the full title of which was the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. And it was more poignantly confirmed by the Constitution of 1787, which began with "We the people of the United States," and listed to form a more perfect union as the first of the purposes stated in the preamble. And following the Civil War, it was reconfirmed by the Supreme Court in the 1869 case of Texas versus White, in which the Chief Justice famously declared, "The Constitution in all its provisions looks to an indestructible union composed of indestructible states." The third thing to be gleaned from that opening phrase is the claim that the colonists were one people distinct from another. This claim was already treason, even before the more obvious treasons that appear later in the document. such as effectively calling the king a tyrant by asserting that he was trying to establish an absolute tyranny over these states. These were English colonists, after all, not a separate group of people who might have been in some existing political compact with the English people that could be simply renounced. Under the English common law doctrine of jus soli, anyone born within the king's dominions, on the king's soil, as it were, was the king's subject and owed a perpetual allegiance to the king that could not be renounced. Yet here at the outset, the Americans are claiming the right to dissolve that political band, that allegiance. And in case the king missed the nuance, the closing paragraph was even more explicit, declaring not only that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, but that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. As an aside, I generated some controversy 6 or 7 weeks back by questioning the citizenship of a candidate for high office that is based on this English common law doctrine of jus soli. But here in the Declaration of Independence is the most eloquent rejection of that old feudal doctrine ever penned. But I digress. Because the right to independence being made could therefore not rest on English law, as had many of the protests leading up to the Declaration, which had routinely referenced violations of the colonists' rights of Englishmen. An appeal to a higher authority than English law needed to be made. And it was made in the very next phrase. And to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. Here then were two sources of authority higher even than English law: the laws of nature and the laws of nature's God, that is, reason and revelation. But the Americans would not simply assert that those higher authorities entitled to them to independence, they would make the case for it, noting that a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. In other words, the Americans would claim their right to independence based on universal truths, but in a way that could persuade the opinions of mankind to the rightness of their cause. And one must acknowledge, hopefully enlist the aid of other nations, particularly the aid of France in the cause. As another aside, think about how difficult it must have been to appeal for aid from France's absolute monarch by making claims rooted in natural law that would destroy the very idea of absolute monarchy. But I digress again. The effort to persuade the opinions of mankind then begins immediately in the second paragraph in language with which we're all familiar. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By using the words truths, Jefferson indicated that what followed would be universal principles. By using the phrase self-evident, he indicated that those universal principles were knowable by human reason, according to the laws of nature, which is to say, the nature of the thing. And by twice referencing creation, created equal and endowed by their creator, he indicated that those universal principles were also revealed by nature's God. So just what are those universal principles, those self-evident truths? Every school child in America used to learn them and hopefully still does. As President Ronald Reagan stated in a speech delivered in Shanghai, China back in 1984, quote, "We believe, and we believe it so deeply that Americans know these words by heart. We believe that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Take an American student or teacher aside later today and ask if he or she hasn't committed those words to memory," close quote. But as importantly, people in many other parts of the globe, from France to Liberia, South America to Asia, and numerous places in between, have learned them too, have looked to them in asserting their own claims of independence and of human rights, have seen in them the same universality that the Americans claimed. The first of those universal principles, then, is that all men, that is, all human beings, are created equal. This is proved perhaps the most difficult of the principles to grasp, with some prominent politicians in American history even claiming that it is a self-evident lie. Indeed, it is patently untrue in almost every ordinary measure, as individuals are manifestly unequal in many ways, unequal in strength or height or beauty or character or intellect or athletic ability or musical talent, or in almost everything that can be observed. Yet Jefferson calls this a truth that is self-evident, which means that, like a good Euclidean proof, it is self-evidently true once one knows the meaning of the terms. What is it that defines man? Well, first, he is created, which means he is not the creator. And second, he has the one thing other created beings do not have, the capacity to reason. Mankind in a hierarchy somewhere between the creator and the brute animals. And in that place in the divine scheme, all of humankind share an equal place by their very nature. In that, and in that alone, are they self-evidently created equal. But that is enough for them to equally partake of the second self-evident truth stated in the Declaration, which both flows from and lends support to the first. That they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. With the explication of this second self-evident truth, this universal principle, the ground for the opening paragraph's claim that the American people, or any people, are entitled to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station, begins to come into view. If human beings have inalienable rights from a creator, then those rights exist prior to government, both in time and in authority. They are therefore not bestowed by human governments and cannot be taken away by human governments. The next batch of truths then brings that ground into sharper focus. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The initial part of this statement of self-evident truth explains the purpose of government, and it flows from the fact that men need government in order that the inalienable rights they have from their creator might be secured. As James Madison would later famously describe it in Federalist 51, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. The latter part of this statement of self-evident truth in the Declaration, the requirement that the just powers of government must be derived from the consent of those who are to be governed, flows necessarily from the fact that all men are created equal, which is to say that no man is entitled to rule others in the way that the Creator has title to rule men, or that men have title to rule beasts. As Thomas Jefferson would describe it just 10 days before his death on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. Now, granted, Jefferson's ownership of slaves was directly at odds with this claim. But as you will see, the failure of the founders to grapple with the problem of slavery fully did not alter the universality of the claims that they were espousing. Next in the Declaration comes the kicker, the last of the self-evident truths espoused in that document, which likewise flows as a necessary corollary from the truths previously described. Quote, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness, close quote. And with this, we get the direct connection between the universal claims of truth and the application of those truths in the bill of particulars that will follow, as asserted by the one people described in the opening paragraph. It is the right of the people to alter or abolish governments that have become destructive of the just ends of government, and to institute new governments on such principles and in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. We have already seen why the universal claims of truth needed to be made. That was necessary to overcome the fact that a Declaration of Independence was in fact a statement of treason under the laws of England. But in vindicating those universal claims, the transition to the particular was equally critical, not just for the Bill of Particular Grievances, but for the fact that the effort to abolish an existing government and establish a new one more conducive to securing individual rights was being made by a particular people at a particular time in the course of human events and in a particular place. This particularity must necessarily be the case in human affairs, because the inalienable right to liberty will always play itself out in different ways. Circumstances will be different at different times and in different places, such that different groups of people might determine that different forms of government would best further their own safety and happiness. The particular circumstances that led to the union of the 13 British colonies on the Atlantic shore of North America in 1776 could hardly be expected to be replicated in other parts of the world at other times, at least not in the same way. As George Washington noted to his fellow citizens in his farewell address, as he urged them to favor the Union over their local attachments, quote, with slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. You have in a common cause fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts of common dangers, sufferings, and successes, close quote. Within a generation or two, however, Washington's description of the common ties of union were no longer true. Even among the original inhabitants and their progeny, the differences in manners, habits, and political principles grew to more than slight shades of difference. The settlers on the western frontier developed decidedly different interests, habits, and customs than the populations in the established cities on the eastern seaboard. And the commercial interests in New England and the mid-Atlantic states diverged significantly from those of the planter class in the South. And with the mass immigrations that took place from 1820 to 1860, primarily from Ireland and Germany, there were millions of new arrivals who not only had a different religion or different language, but who had no direct filial connection with those who had fought in the common cause of independence. Was it possible to maintain a union in such circumstances? Was there really any common thread that could bind together as one people those multiple peoples of different, diverse religious, ethnic, and language backgrounds, and with such different economic interests? Abraham Lincoln provided an answer in his post-4th of July oration in Chicago in 1858. After explaining how annual 4th of July celebrations remind us of all the good done by those who won the Revolutionary War and established the United States, and how we are historically connected with them, and how as a result of the celebrations, we feel more attached to each other and more firmly bound to the country we inhabit, he noted that there was perhaps half of the population who did not share that historical connection, who were not descendants at all of the men of the founding generation. Instead, he said, they are men who have come from Europe, German, Irish, French, and Scandinavian, men that have come from Europe themselves or whose ancestors have come hither and settled here, he said. If they look back through this history to trace their connection with those days by blood, they find that they have none. They cannot carry themselves back into that glorious epoch and make themselves feel that they are part of us. But when they look through that old Declaration of Independence, Lincoln continued, they find that those old men say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And then they feel that that moral sentiment taught in that day evidences their relation to those men, that it is the father of all moral principle in them, and that they have a right to claim it as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men who wrote that declaration. And so they are. That is the electric cord in that declaration that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men together, that will link those patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. In other words, The idea that all men are created equal, that American idea with universal application, would supply the patriotic connection as the father of all moral principle that was missing in those who lacked ties of religion or language or kinship. So there you have it. The nation that began as a particular application of a universal principle to a particular fairly homogeneous people ends up being sustained by resort to that same universal principle by a people that was no longer homogeneous, that was, to use a modern terminology, multi-ethnic and religiously diverse, even if to the modern eye, they were all part of a single class of, quote, white Europeans. That is what made the United States a particular community rooted in the universal, and it has sustained us for nearly 250 years. But the theme of this lecture series is about both community and disunity. So let me now turn to the disunity part. As I see it, there have been three significant threats to our community, all aimed at cutting the electric cord of the Declaration's principle of equality, which, if successful, would destroy or would have destroyed that community that requires a devotion to that moral principle in order to be sustained as a single unified community. I alluded to the first threat to that electric cord of equality above, namely that some American politicians, like Indiana Senator John Pettit, began describing the self-evident truth of human equality as a self-evident lie. John C. Calhoun, senator from South Carolina, who twice served as vice president, called it the most false and dangerous of all political error. Stephen Douglas, the senator from Illinois who authored the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, claimed that the signers of the Declaration had no reference to the Negro whatever when they declared all men to be created equal. They desired to express by that phrase white men, men of European birth and of European descent, and had no reference either to the Negro, the savage Indians, the Fiji, the Malay, or any other inferior or degraded race when they spoke of the equality of men. Close quote. I want to make sure you know that's a quote that I'm reading from, not my own words. Those erroneous sentiments eventually made their way to the Supreme Court when, in the infamous 1857 case of Dred Scott versus Sanford, Chief Justice Roger Taney held that all men did not really mean all men. Although he acknowledged that, quote, the words all men are created equal would seem to embrace the whole human family, he held that it was too clear for dispute that the enslaved African race were not intended to be included, close quote. That fundamental mischaracterization of the Declaration's self-evident truth of human equality allowed for a divergence from principle large enough to cause a civil war. Indeed, it became the cornerstone of the new government established by the seceding states of the Confederacy, which, according to Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, was founded, quote, upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, close quote. Yet proof that Taney was wrong, that the Declaration's claim that all men are created equal really meant all men, all human beings, is found in that very same cornerstone speech by Alexander Stephens. In that, Stephens did not try to distort Jefferson's meaning, as Taney had done, but simply argued that Jefferson was wrong. Quote, the prevailing ideas entertained by him and most of the leading statesmen at the time of the formation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. It was an evil they knew not well how to deal with, but the general opinion of the men of that day was that somehow or other, in the order of providence, the institution would be evanescent and pass away. Those ideas, Stephens continued, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. It was a sandy foundation, and the government built upon it fell when the storm came and the wind blew, close quote. Happily, Taney's grievous error was defeated at Appomattox and ultimately put to rest by the Civil War amendments to the Constitution. But it has unfortunately arisen anew in our own time. In his dissenting opinion in Regents of California versus Bakke, for example, Justice Thurgood Marshall claimed that the self-evident truths and the unalienable rights were intended to apply only to white men. That canard was repeated by Chief Justice William Rehnquist 15 years later in an article published in the Journal of Law and Politics. When in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, Rehnquist wrote, his vision was limited not only to men, but to white men. Most scholars, from the most prominent to the hardly known, modern scholars, from the most prominent to the hardly known, are increasingly following suit, likewise adopting Chief Justice Taney's view as though it were true. Professors Linda Black at the University of Northern Colorado and David Stone at Roosevelt University in Chicago, for example, asserted in a 2005 article in the Journal of Multicultural Counseling and Development that the patriotic ideal that all men are created equal and possess certain inalienable rights is tarnished when one acknowledges that all men meant only male Europeans, close quote. John Marshall Law School professor Cecil Hunt wrote in a 2016 Journal of Civil Rights and Economic Development article that it is clear at the time our founding fathers originally wrote those words, they were literally referring only to men and not women, only to men and not to black men, only to white men of property and not to common men who own neither land nor slaves. Kate Millett claimed in a 2000 Chicago Kent Law Review article that the U.S. Constitution was not has not rewritten its preamble that all men are created equal. It means men, white men, and the text has not been corrected. Not only was she and these others wrong about the meaning of the phrase all men are created equal, but she could not even identify the correct document in which it appears. Perhaps most prominently, Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe and Cornell law professor Michael Dorff, then a law clerk to Ninth Circuit Judge Stephen Reinhart, argued in a 1990 article published in the Chicago Law Review that by all men, the Continental Congress meant only propertied men, or only free men, or only white men, or only free white men with property. I could go on, but those few examples should suffice to make the point. The danger here to our community should be obvious. By mischaracterizing the true meaning of the Declaration Statement of Equality, these scholars and jurists not only cut the electric cord that binds us as a people, they articulate a view of the founding that all but requires that it be torn down. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had a distinctly different view, of course. Here is what he spoke from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in his famous I Have a Dream speech more than a half century ago. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. But I say to you today, my friends, and so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We would do well to recover the good Reverend's view if we are going to have any chance of surviving the Taney revival that is underway. The second significant threat to the electric cord that binds us as a community is based on another misperception of Jefferson's meaning. Ignoring that Jefferson's claim of equality was at the fundamental level of human nature rather than at the level of obvious difference in capacity, those who pushed this distortion of Jefferson's thought made the case that because men had different intellectual capacities, some would be better at governing than others, and so should be entitled to govern. Indeed, on this view, true representative government would have to give way to the rule of experts in unelected administrative agencies who know better than we the people how best we should be governed, and should therefore be allowed to do so unfettered by the legislative process in Congress or the restrictions on power contained in the Constitution. This is a key part of the progressive movement that took hold in the United States a century ago, and it is still playing out today. It was Harvard law professor and later Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter's brainchild that the best and brightest, which is to say his students, would bring their expertise to government, free of the dirty influence of politics. A more recent Harvard law professor and now senator, Elizabeth Warren, advocated the same theory when she successfully urged the creation of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, which was to be free not only of the president's executive authority, but by being able to raise its own operating funds, free of the accountability that inheres in Congress's power of the purse. As is increasingly become obvious, such a view fundamentally rejects the foundational requirement of consent of the governed, and the notion that through that consent, we have delegated legislative powers to Congress, not to unelected and unaccountable agencies. And it is bound to lead, that is already leading, to a two-class society, a governing class of elites and the rest of us. Such a thing is hardly conducive to of equals. The third fundamental threat to our electric court has slowly been in the works for about 80 years, but it is only recently coming to full flower. It too is based on a distortion of the equality principle. Rather than accepting Jefferson's meaning that human beings are inherently equal in their nature as human beings, even though not in their individual capacity, this view pushes a more radical egalitarian argument that to be equal requires equality in all things. That is hardly possible in human affairs. As President Andrew Jackson wisely noted in his veto message of the National Bank Bill in 1832, quote, "Distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. Equality of talents, of education, or of wealth cannot be produced by human institutions. In the full enjoyment of the gifts of heaven and the fruits of superior industry, economy, and virtue, every man is equally entitled to protection by law." In other words, for protection for whatever unequal claims of property his unequal talents earn for him. For it to be otherwise, equality of result must be compelled. This necessity is implicit in the social welfare state theories espoused in President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and in President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And it is now being unambiguously advanced by modern radical egalitarians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her squad of fellow travelers, who demand redistributions of wealth or a provision of government by a free healthcare or free education, free housing, and even guaranteed income. Such a version of equality is simply not possible without destroying the inalienable rights to liberty and the pursuit of happiness also mentioned in the Declaration. Just ask yourselves, who would provide the free healthcare and other goodies? Would doctors be forced to work for free? Or would other citizens be taxed to pay them, effectively making those citizens work for the healthcare of others? I would have thought either scenario to be a violation of the 13th Amendment prohibition on slavery and involuntary servitude. Or even worse, from the requirement of consent of the governed, perhaps we should just run up a tab and leave it to be paid by future generations who had no say whatsoever in the creation of such a debt. So much for the goal stated in our Constitution's preamble of securing the blessings of liberty, not just for ourselves, but for our posterity. The fact is that James Madison had it right in Federalist 10. There, he recognized that the rights of property originate from the diversity in the faculties of men. And aren't we all for diversity these days? The protection of these faculties is the first object of government, Madison then asserted, adding that from the protection of different and unequal faculties of acquiring property, the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results. That is one of the latent causes of faction in society, to be sure, but it is rooted in human nature and cannot be eliminated without destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence, as the radical egalitarian proposals would surely do. Madison knew that would be a remedy worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, he said, an ailment without which it instantly expires. But it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to the political life because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. One would have thought such radical egalitarianism was put to rest a couple of millennia ago, when Plato made a mockery of a community of wives and children, but apparently not. We should not deceive ourselves, though, into thinking that a community based on a perpetual equal distribution of goods is possible among a free people. For the loss of liberty that would be required has a word, and that word is despotism. That is not to say that some divergences in wealth are not unjust, but radical egalitarianism is not a proper remedy, either in justice or in efficacy. President Jackson acknowledged the problem in his national bank veto message, but also proposed a very different remedy. But when the laws undertake to add to these natural and just advantages, he said, artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. Its evils exist only in its abuses. If it would confine itself to equal protection, that is, neither unequal protection or equal outcome, and as heaven does its rains, shower its favors alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. Close quote. Jackson's message is based on the true understanding of the Declaration's principle of equality, the only understanding that is consistent with liberty. Only by recovering that idea can we address the rent-seeking abuses of Washington lobbyists without irretrievably destroying the electric cord that has and still can bind us together as one people. As I said, these are the three threats that have been leveled in our nation's history against the electric cord of the Declaration's principle of equality. One has already yielded a bloody civil war, and the revival of that era, together with the other threats still underway, is threatening another. But I would be remiss not to acknowledge that a fourth threat, perhaps as dangerous as the others, is now afoot in the land. That is the current embrace of a multiculturalism that is nothing short of tribalism, an ideology that, far from embracing different races and cultures in a single devotion to the principle of equality, turns the notion of individual equality into an equality of group rights that cannot but pit group against group, tribe against tribe. Such a movement is about as far removed from Lincoln's electric cord as John C. Calhoun's claims that slavery was a positive good was removed from Jefferson's statement of the self-evident truth of equality. If this ideology metastasizes, as is certainly possible, this country will dissolve in a disunity that will make look positively mild in comparison the recent balkanization of the land that in ancient times was the cradle of Western civilization. Can we stop such a thing from happening? We can, if we would simply educate ourselves as to the true meaning of the principles espoused by Thomas Jefferson in our Declaration of Independence. Rededicate ourselves, as Abraham Lincoln did at Gettysburg, to recovering that electric cord that binds us together as a people, despite our many faceted differences. And dare to dream, as the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. did on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. In other words, let us make this country into a particular, unified, one people, focused not on what makes us different, but on the universal self-evident truths by which we are all truly created equal, so that we can truly say, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thanks for that eloquent defense of the moral equality of humanity, and to my mind, at least as important, of the reading of the Constitution and other founding documents that champions it. I appreciate that. That's from in my own voice, and now I'm going to read questions from the audience. So Thomas Cleveland asks, in his polemic against Bork in The Storm Over the Constitution, Jaffa argues that originalism, as articulated by Bork and Scalia, is a form of positivism akin to Taney's. What do you make of this argument?
Well, I'm obviously a student of Professor Jaffa's and agree with him on this. One of the reasons I put not just Thurgood Marshall, but Chief Justice Rehnquist's claims about the distortion or the erosion of the Declaration is precisely because of that. The Declaration of the Constitution acknowledges slavery, of course, but the principles of the Declaration did not. And trying to grapple with the compromises with slavery in order to accomplish a political union that would be viable required that they push off resolution of the incompatibility of that institution with its moral principles, with its universal principles for a time. That time, unfortunately, extended much longer than they had anticipated. As Alexander Stephens himself thought, spoke in his cornerstone speech for the Confederacy, they all thought that the universal principle of equality prohibited slavery, and that slavery would die on the vine in short order as a result of their statement of principle. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and we end up with the Civil War. It's important for us to understand that the turn that Taney takes is being repeated by both conservatives and liberals today, and it does not point a path down a good path for us, I think.
This is from someone you may know, named Elizabeth Eastman. How do the scholars who are dismissive of the universal meaning of the Declaration's principle, all men are created equal, respond to the Civil War amendments?
Well, they claim that it changed the American founding rather than vindicating the American founding. And that therefore we can throw off all of the work of the founding generation and just make a new constitution. But if you look at Martin Luther King's work, what the Civil War amendments do and the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s does is perfect the American founding. It makes us live up to our promise. If we don't know what that promise is, or we get it wrong, or we think it is fundamentally flawed, in the pluralistic society that we have become, it's hard to imagine how we can retain ourselves as a unified community that will break apart. Lincoln understood that, and by recovering the American idea, the true meaning of the American founding, contrary to the positivism of Stephen of Douglas and others at the time, he attempted to challenge us to live up to that moral authority, just as Martin Luther King did.
We have a question about whether there's going to be another civil war, or perhaps already is another civil war. Don't you think that this country has been divided for so long that we are now on a course of events that are not only unavoidable, but very violent, sown by the media and misinformation on the internet?
Well, I do, and that's why I raised the 3 or 4 challenges, because I think it doesn't necessarily need to lead to that. But the problem is there are too many among our fellow citizens that either don't know the Declaration of Independence at all, or have been taught erroneous views of what it meant and what it means. And therefore there's nothing there to grab onto that can bring us back together as a unified community. And we see this breaking out in lots of ways, on the streets of our nation's leading cities these days. I taught in my class today, one of my classes, I taught Edmund Burke, not the famous thing he's known for, the Reflections on the Revolution in France, but which was published in 1790 before the French Revolution turned to the Reign of Terror phase. But his letters on regicide in France that were published after the Reign of Terror, and he calls that regicide phase 3 things in the description. He calls it regicide, Jacobinism, and atheism. But the description he provides to the 3 words bears an uncanny similarity with what we're experiencing now. A notion that any restrictions on the power of the raw democracy raw majority will is itself a usurpation of power that warrants death by the usurpers and anybody affiliated with them. And then the Jacobinism that would demand the abolition of property, or the taking of property that was earned, and to redistribute it to those who are without property that are part of that new governing democracy. And the attack on the vicious attack on the church that we saw in France, we see some semblance of that beginning anew in this country. So these things are very serious threats. But understanding those threats and understanding the thing about the American Revolution that prohibited that reign of terror that happened in the French Revolution from happening. But by recovering that true American spirit, that American idea, I think we can forestall or hopefully avoid altogether the dangers, the perils that seem to be upon us.
Thanks. The queue is open, I'll just say, but I'm going to take this opportunity to ask a question of my own. If I understood you correctly, your criticism of the administrative state, as we might call it, ushered in by the progressive movement, you saw a parallel between that and the denial of the moral equality of humanity, if I understood you correctly. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that, since obviously it doesn't wear that kind of rhetoric on its sleeve.
Right. And certainly they would avoid such rhetoric wherever they could. But look, we the American people, we the people of the United States, to use the opening phrase of the Constitution, create a certain form of government. It was designed to ensure, as best as we could, protection of individual liberty, while simultaneously allowing for a majority to rule. Those two things are oftentimes incompatible, because majorities, when they get power, this is the raw democracy piece, tend to abuse that power just like anybody else that gets power. We call it majority tyranny. So the structure of our Constitution is designed to put checks in the way of the ability of a majority to exercise its power in a tyrannical way. Separation of powers and federalism, and the notion that the House of Representatives was elected differently than the Senate, the idea of an electoral college, what we call the non-delegation doctrine. I know very deep in the Constitution. It's in Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1 of the Constitution. The legislative powers given to the federal government are vested in Congress. Those are the structures that we the people, by our consent, created. And it was designed to create a measure of accountability, ongoing accountability to the people by frequent elections to the House of Representatives. When I pass off the lawmaking power to unelected agencies in the administrative state, that I don't have a chance to throw out of office if they get it wrong, that there's no accountability. And when I insulate those administrative agencies, even from the titular head of the executive branch, the president, by prohibiting removal, but for cause, and all these other techniques that have been deployed over the last 80 years, I really create a government that is on autopilot, free from the political accountability that comes from our elections. And that seems to me to undermine the very premise of consent to the governed. Now, Felix Frankfurter, made the case that, well, these people are brighter than the rest of you all, and they're going to govern for their common good better than you possibly can. Well, that belies a certain distrust of the equality that is the essence of believing that the American people are capable of governing themselves.
I wonder, other than appointing Randy Barnett to the Supreme Court, which I don't expect to happen, how would the administrative state be dismantled? Is that a plausible possibility?
Well, I'll tell you a little story. I run a public interest litigation center as well as my teaching duties. It's called the Claremont Institute Center for Constitutional Jurisprudence. And about 20 years ago, in a case we were involved in, involving delegation of powers to the National Transportation Commission, American Trucking was the name of the case. I realized that we had this huge separation of powers problem. That lawmaking power was no longer exercised by Congress. We pass resolutions, commemorating National Blueberry Month or whatever we do. That's about all Congress does. But all the real work of lawmaking, the hard policy judgments, are being made by unelected agencies. And I said, if we're going to retain our freedom much longer, we really have to confront that. But this had been in place for 60 or 70 years, since the middle of the 1930s and the advent of the New Deal. And it's just gotten progressively worse over time. And I was at a meeting of leaders of conservative and libertarian public interest firms, and I raised the issue. I said, guys, we got to start pushing on this. And I practically got laughed out of the room. There's just too much water under that bridge, Eastman. It's never going to happen. But we started hammering it, and within a half decade, led by Justice Thomas, but now several other justices on the Supreme Court, Justice Alito, Justice Gorsuch in particular, Justice Kavanaugh while he was judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, all began raising serious concerns about the violations of separation of powers that allowed executive agencies to write law, to enforce their own laws that they wrote, and then to interpret their own laws and to prosecute those who violate them. Montesquieu called the combination of executive, legislative, and judicial powers tyranny, and we started to see those agencies acting in such a fashion. So there's been some pushback. It hasn't come to fruition yet, but there is much more serious engagement on those issues than there was even a decade ago.
Thanks. Here's a question from one of our scholars, Alvaro Casobello. He says, thank you for your lecture, Professor Eastman. A number of the documents that you cited throughout the lecture had in their context and have in their uses different purposes: declaratory, legal decisions, speeches, texts with an intent to govern. Methodologically speaking, how do you reconcile the different purposes and intents of texts such as the Declaration, the Constitution, and the I Have a Dream speech?
Yeah, very good question, and thank you. We could treat some of those texts just like rhetorical statements. The Declaration could be just treated as, just a rhetorical flourish to try and get France to side with us in our efforts to throw off England as our master. But it seems to me that if we try and understand these texts as those who wrote them understood them themselves, we find in the Declaration a much more serious enterprise, a much more long-lasting and universal enterprise. And Jefferson himself says this. He wasn't making up anything new, but he was trying to put down the common sense of the matter in a way that would be applicable to not just us, but applicable to all human beings at all times. It's the universality of those ideas that then get by to the extent prudently possible. And we can have a whole fight over whether they were right about their prudent judgments in compromising with slavery. But to the extent they thought prudently possible, codifying those universal principles into a governing document. And as my mentor Harry Jaffa has argued for his whole life, you can't understand the difference between the compromises of the Constitution and the principles of the Constitution without resort to the underlying principles as articulated in the Declaration. And then you fast forward to something like Martin Luther King's speech. He's treating the Declaration as the founders themselves understood it, as a statement of high moral principle to live up to. We're human beings. We're not perfect. We're never going to live up to it in full measure. And there are always going to be prudent judgments of how much can be done at any given time without collapsing the whole system. But Martin Luther King understood that in a way that Taney simply refused to accept. And that legal document, that opinion in Dred Scott, is the antithesis of the moral claims set out in the Declaration. So yes, they're different documents, but they are addressing the same issue, coming at it from diametrically opposed directions. And it seems to me incumbent upon us to figure out which was the right, the just one, the one grounded in natural truths, and then try and live by that to the extent we can.
Good. I'm curious whether you see any of the recent Supreme Court decisions, not merely as wrongly decided. I'm sure that you do. Everyone does, but as being wrongly decided in ways that pose a fundamental threat to the reading of the Constitution and the founding principles more generally that you're advocating for here.
Yeah, I'm gonna venture into a topic that would be divisive, but I see if I can get beyond the particular of the topic and then the legal claim that was made in the case. And it's the case, the 1993, 91, I forget exactly the year, abortion case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Take the abortion controversy off the table for a moment. What Justice Kennedy and Justice O'Connor and Justice Souter say in that case, in defense of adhering to the precedent of Roe versus Wade, even while acknowledging they thought it was probably wrong, is that the power that inheres in our Constitution is most fundamentally assigned to the court, and that even if the American people are refuse to accept Roe as a wrong decision, that the court cannot succumb to that political pressure by the people without undermining the very notion of the political power of the Constitution. Now that seems to me about as fundamentally wrong with both the principles of the Declaration and the opening language of the Constitution as you can possibly get. And the notion that the court has the ability to thwart and to defend, or to adhere to wrong decisions, even against a constant challenge by we the people sovereign in the society, really does turn the notion of consent of the governed on its head. And I off the top of my head, I can't think of anything as egregiously wrong in principle as that. And I say that quite apart from the particular controversy that evoked it. The principle that they articulate there to defend their decision is just as fundamentally contrary to the principles of the Declaration as one can imagine.
Thanks. So with the Supreme Court,
I got a whole longer list of other problems with the court, but that will be topic for another lecture, I suppose.
I don't doubt it. With the Supreme Court making errors like that, at least occasionally, and presidents from both parties now governing via executive order with the pen and the phone. The administrative state pretty firmly entrenched, and despite their unelected status. How do we get Congress to legislate anymore?
So one of the mechanical mistakes or assumptions that I think the founders got wrong, was that separation of powers would keep each branch of government within its assigned lanes. Ambition would counteract ambition. They couldn't envision that Congress would pass off its lawmaking power because that was the source of their power. Why would they ever do that? What they didn't anticipate is Congress creatively figuring out a way to nominally pass off the power so that they didn't have to take any accountability for the hard policy judgments, but then behind the scenes exercise that power through ongoing committee relationships with the agencies that they are supervising. And that means the people that are making decisions don't have any accountability. Congress gets to take credit for creating clean air and clean water without any of the consequences of the cost to jobs, to lives, to health, or whatever that come from that. None of these are easy policy judgments. They all involve trade-offs. In fact, it's even worse than that, because they figured out how to blame the agencies for the bad parts of the trade-off, but then use it to create the coin of their realm for their reelection. If you're a major donor to me, I can figure out how to get you a waiver from that rule that's causing so much problem for everybody else. And so not only do they not have the accountability, they actually have a vested incentive of having the system that of no accountability that they've set up. And it seems to me that, of course, the executive agencies are happy to have the power. Congress is happy to get the coin of the realm from the pretended abdication of that power. So the third branch of government was supposed to step in, and that is to enforce the lines of authority and the limitations on power actually delegated in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. The court's abdication on that, because the modern court has viewed its role not as enforcing the limitations on the exercise of power, but only on the powers when they infringe on provisions of the Bill of Rights. Other than that, they viewed the powers given to the federal government as essentially plenary and omniscient, right? And it's the court abdication on that fundamentally important aspect of its duty that I think has led us where we are. One of the things that we've seen in Thomas and Scalia, Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, perhaps, and from her short tenure, 3-year tenure on the Seventh Circuit, I suspect from Amy Coney Barrett as well, is a revival of the notion that the court is supposed to enforce the enumerated powers as well as just the Bill of Rights. And I think that will start getting us back in the right direction. The other thing, surprisingly, that's helped here, I was very suspicious or wondered whether President Trump would take advantage of some of the precedents. I have a pen and I have a phone precedent from Obama, or the TARP precedent from Bush. You recall this one when we did the financial bailout, it didn't include the auto industry. He asked Congress to expand it to include the auto industry. They refused, so he did it by executive order. Those two ignoring of executive authority could have served as a great precedent for President Trump. I was surprised at how carefully he and his team stayed within the lines of statutory authority that had been given. Now, the fact that he was exercising those delegated statutory authorities rather than somebody else has all of a sudden a lot of people reviving an interest in the non-delegation doctrine that I've been arguing for years. But what we can't tolerate is a non-delegation doctrine that applies just to this president, and then we'll go back to letting the executive have delegated powers all at once. If we're going to revive the non-delegation doctrine and restore separation of powers, we really need to do it for every president.
Great. Thank you very much. I think that you've answered all of the questions. So I want to thank you for a stimulating lecture and Q&A session, and glad to have you here. That's
Thank
all.
you very
Will you
much.
join me, please, in thanking Professor Eastman?
I can hear the applause. Thank you. And thanks to the Benson Center.